A very warm welcome to all of you to this webinar for International GCSE Islamic Studies. I am Stephen Darlington and I am the Chair of Islamic Studies for Pearson. The aim of this session is to provide insights into the performance of the 2024 candidates, both where they perform well and in the areas in which they can improve. We're going to take two approaches. First of all, we will look at the 4 question types that appear on the paper each year and consider the strengths and the weaknesses we saw this year in responding to the challenge of each. We will also look at some of the specific questions of 2024 and consider where the candidates seemed particularly able to answer the question or found it challenging. So, without further ado, let's unpack the challenges of each question type. Just to remind you that you can always pause a slide in case you need to read it more carefully, and also you can reverse and go back and review a slide that has passed during the slideshow. All the A questions on the paper ask for isolated examples of knowledge. In sections A and B, they ask for 2, and in section C for just 1. Candidates don't always have to write full sentences. Sometimes just a single word will answer the question. Most candidates find these types of questions quite straightforward, so marks are only lost if they lack accurate knowledge or provide insufficient responses. Let's look at a couple of examples. So this is an example of where the candidate became confused between 2 different people, Ali Talib and his father Abu Talib. Consequently, part of the answer is incorrect, and only one of the 2 marks was gained. And here is an example of another simple error. In this case, there is just one response, even though it extends over several lines. So it is worth reminding your students that there are no marks for development in the A questions, and that short, knowledge-based answers are the best approach. Moving on to the B questions. We have to accept that they do provide more of a challenge, and that was again in evidence this year. As can be seen from the SAMs and the principal examiner reports, the B questions look for a single response with 2 simple developments. This is because full marks are awarded to candidates who are able to show understanding of their answer by expanding it further. This is certainly best illustrated with an example. This is an answer to the question about the challenges faced by Muslim leaders in the modern world. Pause the recording, read it through, look for the response, and then for the 2 developments. The challenge given in this answer is that Muslim beliefs often do not align with those of other countries. That would gain the 1st mark. But we are also looking for a simple explanation of the point they have made. And in this case, they do provide 2 developments to gain the further 2 marks. They say that, as a consequence, some Muslim countries are perceived differently. This may seem like a very simple development, but in B questions, the examiner is not looking for anything more than that. Then, they go on to say, as a further consequence, that Muslim countries may even be regarded as backward societies. This level of a simply developed response is what was needed to gain all 3 marks. Let's now look at an example where the approach to the question is incorrect. This is an answer to the question about what, according to the Quran, is taught by the Injil. Read it through and try to see where the candidate makes a mistake in the response. Remember, you can pause the slide if necessary. So first of all, let's accept that there are 3 entirely correct teachings from the Quran about the Injil, and if they were answering an A question, each of these would have been marked as correct and received an individual mark. But the answers are distinct. There is no connection between them. And so the candidate has not demonstrated the skill of showing further understanding of the answer they have given. And consequently, this long answer gained only 1 of the 3 available marks. When we move on to the C questions, the challenge continues to increase. This becomes clear when we remember that the answers are marked according to levels. Now, these levels are provided alongside this PowerPoint presentation. And this may be a good moment for you to pause the slide, take a bit of a break perhaps, and also take the opportunity to look at the levels for C questions, and perhaps also for the D questions that we will look at a little bit later. First of all, you will have noted that they ask for explanations of beliefs or practices, and so simple knowledge is not sufficient. And secondly, to gain the higher marks, candidates need to provide not just more information, but evidence of a developed understanding of the topic in question. It was clear again this year that some candidates make the mistake of thinking in terms of points-marked answers, like in A and B questions, and that the more information they can give will result in higher marks. But that is incorrect. Again, to illustrate the change in the challenge, we can now look at some examples. This question asks candidates to explain the importance of the Prophet's relations with his wives and children. Note that the focus is on the importance of. It does not ask for lots of information, but only sufficient information, sufficient knowledge, to illustrate an explanation of why this is important. Read through the response and try to form a view about how successfully they do this before moving to the next slide. This response does show some understanding, but it is also quite descriptive. There are relevant facts, but there is a weaker response to the challenge of explaining why the relationships are important. And it is the explanation that is the key to gaining top-level marks in the C questions. Because this is mainly a descriptive response, the marks would have been limited to level 2. Now we can compare this to a better response, one that would gain full marks. Again, pause the slide, read through the answer, and look for where the candidate responds to the demand of explaining the importance of the relationship between the Prophet and his wives and children. In this response, the candidate has also demonstrated important, relevant knowledge, but they also provide a developed understanding of why these details are important. This includes 2 key ideas: moral example and its influence on others, and specifically on the way Islam might be perceived by non-believers. They also say this could help create a legal framework with a focus on the rights of women and children. These two developed ideas about why the relationships are important, and this is what takes the answer into level 3. Of course, the challenge then builds again when we get to the D questions, and some candidates will find these greater demands more difficult to meet. Just a reminder to look at the D levels mark scheme if you haven't already done so. You can pause the slides here again if you need to. In D questions, candidates continue to need to use the relevant knowledge and to show developed understanding as they did for the C questions. But to gain top level marks in D questions, there are now 2 further challenges, and not all candidates responded to these demands. Firstly, to make accurate use of the assigned text, and secondly, to look at more than one point of view in responding to the stimulus. Again, this will be clearer with some examples. For D, we will look only at extracts from answers rather than full answers, which can sometimes run to 3 or 4 pages. In the following slide, read this part of a candidate's answer and see which demands of the mark scheme are met. Remember, they are development, an alternative point of view, and use of the assigned text. So take a few moments to read, pause the slide if you need to, and then there will be some comments on the next slide. So this is an example of an answer that makes a simple, though valid point, and then spends most of the answer just repeating the same idea, which is about obligation. The answer lacks development, which could have come from a consideration of why fasting is prescribed and what might be the benefits. Such an undeveloped response, if that lack of development is repeated throughout the answer, is likely to achieve level 2 with a maximum of half the available marks. Again, this is just a snippet from a much fuller answer, but pause the slide briefly to have a read. It is possible to see in this short extract that the candidate understands the need for development. It moves beyond the issue of obligation and develops a response that focuses on the spiritual value of fasting, namely, getting closer to Allah, how it can lead to gaining taqwa, and therefore it is a source of spiritual strength. Now here is a third extract. Again, read through this part of a response with the same demands from the mark scheme in mind. Again, pause the slide so you can read it more carefully. So here we see an example of an alternative point of view being put forward. It focuses on the teaching that fasting is not an obligation on those who are sick. And also, the answer is illustrated with reference to the prescribed text, which says that Allah intends ease, not hardship. It is still a simple answer, without evidence that we've seen so far of much development. But with the alternative point of view, and with a reference to the text, the full answer has the potential, at least, to progress through all the levels. Of course, it is not just the style of question that poses a challenge to candidates, but also sometimes the subject matter itself. Each year, the principal examiner will seek to balance the exam paper with a range of challenges. This allows weaker candidates to demonstrate their knowledge. It also gives an opportunity to more able candidates to show their developed levels of understanding and their ability to evaluate issues raised by the questions. It will be useful to schools to know what kind of subject matter provided this range of challenge in 2024, which can be illustrated in two different kinds of subject matter. Reading the answers given by candidates in 2024, and this has been true in previous years, it seems they are likely to do well on questions that rely on their recollection of stories and teaching. This is because of the great emphasis placed by many schools teaching Islam on the importance of knowing Muslim history and learning the Quran. This stands students in good stead on the Islamic Studies paper, because there are many questions in the specification with the same focus. I've included here some examples of questions that have this focus. If you read these examples, you will see that one common thread is that of recollection. This is an important skill, and it is one that was at the forefront of GCSE reforms that took place some years ago. And this example of an answer shows clearly the level of detail that many candidates learn and remember about important events in Islamic history. In this case, there is far more information than is needed for the answer to a B question. But the point of this example is to show how well prepared many candidates were this year for questions of this kind. This is a C question and requires explanation as well as information. If you read through this answer, it's clear that festivals form part of the life of this candidate, and they are able to use that experience to illustrate their answer very effectively. A similar ability was shown by many candidates regarding the fast during Ramadan, either from their own experience or perhaps what they have learnt from the experience of their parents. Again, pause the slideshow in order to have a proper read of this answer. So although traditionally on this paper there is a great weight attached to the skill of recollection, with the new specification there also came a greater focus on a wider range of skills. Consequently, candidates who aspire for the higher levels of marks need to show some other skills as well. These are some of the required skills that candidates found more challenging this year. They did not always have an awareness of the situation of Muslims in the wider society. Also, some seemed limited to knowledge of teachings, without always understanding some of the underlying principles behind those teachings. And finally, for some, there was a reluctance to engage in any kind of debate or discussion. Here are some of the questions asked in 2024 that seem to pose that greater challenge. For example, many candidates knew many Sharia teachings, but fewer candidates were able to answer the question about qiyas. They seemed less well prepared to delve deeper into the way Sharia law is able to respond to questions that have arisen since the time of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Also, in this example of a D question, candidates were fully aware of the importance of understanding Allah as merciful and just, but were challenged by the need to consider how and why his other qualities might be viewed as having greater importance. We can illustrate this with some examples in the following slides. Here, we can see an answer in which the candidate has only the most general understanding of the ways in which Sharia can be clarified to meet new legal and moral issues. It does not touch on the subject of qiyas at all. Pause the slide, read through the answer, which represents quite a few similar responses, and then compare it with the one in the following slide. In this case, we can see that the candidate has been taught and has understood some of the more complex issues relating to the application of Sharia and of qiyas in particular. This is the level of understanding that candidates require to gain marks in the higher levels. Of course, as teachers, we know that not all our students will absorb this level of understanding, but it is a matter of degree. Read through this response, pause the slide if you need to gain a full understanding of the thoroughness of this particular answer. I should also say that too many candidates gained no marks on this question because it appeared they had not learnt about this topic at all. With just a simple level of understanding, they could have gained some extra marks. We can now look at responses to the D question about the attributes of Allah. Most candidates were able to list the reasons why Allah is described as merciful and just. However, far fewer candidates were able to focus on other attributes and try to compare their importance with Allah's mercy and justice. Here is an example of a candidate with just that approach. Almost a complete answer was focused on mercy and justice. It is important to note that this kind of discussion in D questions does not require the candidate to say that Allah's mercy and justice are not important. Sometimes, however, it does seem that there is a reluctance in some candidates to discuss and compare aspects of belief in any way. If they had simply gone on to name another attribute, and offer some reason why it might also be seen as very important, more marks would have been gained. Pause the slide and read this response, which is part of another answer to the same question. It illustrates very well how candidates can respond to these two questions. Tawheed is a very appropriate attribute of Allah to use in this context, for the reason given in the answer. Tawheed is one of the 5 articles of faith enshrined in the 5 pillars. The answer also goes on to say why belief in the mercy and justice of Allah is essential to Muslims. In this way, the candidate has demonstrated understanding of another aspect of belief in Allah's nature, was able to discuss as required by the question, but at no point needed to doubt any other aspect of Muslim belief. We are almost done, but it is always useful to have a reminder of some of the key ideas that have been outlined. We looked at the different question types and the challenges of each. We looked at some specific questions, some where candidates did well, and others where a number of candidates seemed less well prepared for how to respond. Different question types have different challenges. It is very important that candidates practice on each question type so that they can move easily from presenting knowledge to providing explanations and to engaging in discussion. Each step in the question types involves a test of a different skill, and top marks can only be gained by candidates who are ready to give evidence that they possess each skill level. We also saw that most candidates are at ease with narrative, knowledge-based responses. This is important. But it is also important to encourage students to look more deeply into the more complex topic. Taking relevant examples from SAMs and past papers, explaining them in class, and setting questions for homework will help candidates get used to gaining and demonstrating a developed understanding. And finally, we come back to the issue of discussion. It is really important because more than half the total marks are given for answers to discussion questions. So, encourage students to understand that discussion does not mean to question aspects of their faith. No D question will ever require that. Also, have discussions in the classroom and help students develop an ability to look at more than one point of view. Finally, please contact your subject advisor for more support in delivering this qualification. The relevant email address and phone number is here on this slide. Finally, a big thank you from me. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this session has been helpful.